Good evening, everybody. A very warm welcome to all of you on behalf of Azim Premji University. We are delighted to present today's program in our series of public lectures, which are held here in Bangalore and in Bhopal every month. Public lectures are one of the ways by which the Azim Premji Foundation promotes its vision. All our public lectures, close to 100 so far, are available on our YouTube channel, and I invite you to view them. I know you come to our public lectures because you are well-wishers of Azim Premji University and invested in the education and development of the country. Many of our students from the Bangalore campus are here. Thank you all. A brief introduction to the speaker and the interlocutor. Mr. Suman Bery's CV was part of the invitation, so I'll just pick a few highlights. Suman Bery is the Vice Chairman of NITI Aayog. His experience is truly eclectic, having served at the World Bank for 28 years, been the chief economist for Shell, worked at think tanks, and been the Director-General of the National Council of Applied Economic Research. Mr. Bery read for the PPE at Oxford and topped it by going across the pond, as the British would call it, that is the Atlantic, to Princeton for his master's. We are specially delighted that Mrs. Maitreyi Bery is also with us today. Our public lectures follow a format where we have the speaker deliver their talk, and then one of my colleagues from the university engages the speaker in a short conversation. Today it will be Professor Arjun Jaydev. Arjun teaches economics at the university and was previously at the University of Massachusetts, Boston. Post his PhD, he was a postdoctoral fellow at the Committee on Global Thought at Columbia. He is also the editor of the Journal of Globalization and Development, along with Joseph Stiglitz and a few others. Please join me now in welcoming Mr. Suman Bery.
Thank you very much, Mr. Venkatesan. My thanks to the Azim Premji University for giving me this platform and for their excellent work in stimulating public debate through these lectures. And I have looked at some of them online, and I will look at others as well, not only my own. And I look forward to the interaction with Professor Jaydev later. So I had said that I would try and be brief, but my wife, who's here, knows that I'm sort of incapable of that, but I will try and adhere to roughly the timing I'd suggested. So my title, it's around the topic that was mentioned, is on harnessing India's Amrit Kal. And as you know, Prime Minister in 2022 christened the next 25 years as India's Amrit Kal, which is the age of nectar. And part of what I hope to convey through my remarks is really why this is such an important moment for India. So this is a direct quote from the speech that the Prime Minister gave from the Red Fort this year, even though the first call to Viksit Bharat was in 2022 at after 75 years of India's independence, the 76th year of 76th Independence Day address. What is important about the speech is that it was delivered at the beginning of the Prime Minister's third term. And the phrase that's highlighted here, our process of reforms is not driven by compulsion, but by the intention to strengthen the nation. A challenge, frankly, that I will be discussing is that it's quite different to preach and want reform when, by all accounts, the economy is doing fairly well than say, in 1991, when India had its back to the wall. And so most of my talk today is to provide a framework within which to think about what one means by reform, why reform might be necessary, and how to think about as long an expanse as 23 years to 2047. So the first part of my talk is on Viksit Bharat. And so three questions, which I won't read each one of these, but I think which would be interesting to talk about as well. First, why Viksit Bharat? Second, what is Viksit Bharat? And third, why now? Now, those of you who would remember what the Prime Minister said in 2022, he talked about a developed society, not just a developed economy, and his goal was basically empowered citizens and a country that has strategic economy. And what is Viksit Bharat? It is a modern society, not just a high-income economy. I think a point that he made repeatedly in this year's speech was the importance of confidence. Confident individuals who are given support to develop their talents and realize their aspirations. And very importantly, a shift in the relationship, which I'll talk about later, between the citizen and government, a citizen-oriented government rather than citizens being oppressed by the government. And more importantly, the question of why now is because, as I'll discuss later, the recent record does give India confidence. The Amrit Kal that I'm talking about is associated largely with India's demographic dividend. It's associated with the changes in technology, and what better place to talk about that than Bangalore, and emerging technologies which should be and can be harnessed in a positive way, although there's a lot of anxiety about, particularly in the West, about the destructive dimensions of something like AI, but also global trends. Aging populations, both to our east and west, but not fortunately in India at the moment. The shifting of global supply chains, the so-called China plus one moment. And then also the power of India's diaspora, and also India's success in harnessing and seeing itself as a voice of the global South. I talked about the strong foundations, and I would like to really talk about them in the following heads briefly to go into the discussion: growth, resilience, productivity, and inclusion. Now, we tend to be dazzled, and rightly so, by China's growth performance. And I'm not sure, to a general audience like this, how important the abstract concept of growth is. But for economists, growth is what makes other good things possible. India has a surprisingly robust track record of maintaining roughly 6% average real GDP growth over 3 decades. And what matters for people's felt experience is per capita income. And over these 3 decades, India's aggregate growth rate of the population has been slowing to below 2%. So the performance of per capita income has been even better. And I say this because there is a tendency for countries to have good growth decades and then revert to the mean. The surprising thing is that India's growth has stayed steady for 3 decades on average. It goes up and down because of what are called, because of shocks, typically on the demand side, but we do rebound. And that raises the issue of resilience. We know that we rebounded rapidly from the COVID shock, the fastest growing major economy post-COVID. Now, what does this reflect? I believe it reflects good policy, but also a pretty dynamic private sector at all levels, but particularly the large corporate sector. Productivity is what makes for rising standards of living, and a rather technical term called total factor productivity. It contributed 30% to India's GDP growth, and this really reflects improvements in management, shifts from agriculture to manufacturing and higher productivity activities. But also, all of this has not been at the expense of inclusion. NITI Aayog itself puts out something called the National Multidimensional Poverty Index, and based on an authoritative survey called the National Family Health Survey, we estimated that in just 5 years, from 2015-16 to 2019, just before COVID, 135 million citizens escaped multidimensional poverty. And now in the third term, the focus is on youth, the poor, women and farmers, but also tribals and left behind districts. So, as I said before, things have been going pretty well. And now the question becomes how not to lapse into complacency, but how to use this as a tailwind for raising our game. So now the link between growth and reform. As I've noted, India's past growth has been impressive, but sustaining this growth rate in a much larger and now more complex economy still requires effort. Just because you've achieved 6% growth doesn't mean that nature is going to, or God is going to keep giving it to you. So even staying at 6%, and I'll tell you, how much more we should be aiming for, is not a cakewalk. However, with clear vision, which I think we have, or we're blessed with, a flexible strategy and appropriate reforms, growth acceleration is possible and is needed to reach high income, as I'll define in a bit, by 2047. Faster growth requires a higher investment rate, both public and private, for at least the next decade. But equally important is rising productivity and global competitiveness through better use of both public and private resources. And this requires redefining the interaction between the private sector, government at all levels, India's citizens, and the outside world. And I'll go into this in more detail, but these realignments will shape a reform strategy. And I would go so far as to say is that elements of all of these interfaces were present in this year's budget, as well as in the Prime Minister's speech. I won't dwell on that, but I can give examples in the Q&A. Now, what are India's 2047 aspirations? I'll talk first about the economics and then talk about, as it were, what really matters is social indicators. So the World Bank, as an operational institution, defines four categories of country: low income, which India used to be, but has gone beyond; lower middle income. By the way, the term GNI means gross national income. It's a version of gross domestic product, but it includes remittances from abroad and other transfers from abroad, which are actually quite important for India. So lower middle income at the moment in 2022 is the range that's indicated there. Upper middle income from 4,400 to 1,385, and upper income above 13,845. The important point is that India, by this measure, is at 2,300, 2,380. India's per capita income, therefore, if we are to reach the current measure of higher upper income, which is 13,845, would have to increase by approximately 6 times in 25 years. Now, the simple arithmetic of the rule of 72 indicates that at 7%, an economy or any number doubles in 10 years. So that would mean that in 30 years, we would expect to be 8 times our current per capita income. So going from 6 to 7%, and if we can manage it above that, is what would be required to have a chance of getting to this upper income metric or figure of 13,845. Other countries have done it, but it's not that easy, and it is unlikely that we will have smooth growth at 7% year after year. So what one's talking about is on average, which means that in the good years we need to do better. Now, government has also put out, so that we can measure ourselves against the global economy, figure in 2047 US dollars, not 2022 US dollars. And the aspiration there is for India to be a $30 trillion economy with a per capita income of $18,000 by 2047. But this is only worthwhile if it is accompanied by tangible improvements in social indicators, life expectancy at birth to go up to 84 years, currently at 70, the literacy rate to rise to 100%, and very importantly, the female labor force participation. Now, the NITI Aayog, NITI, as you know in Hindi, is policy, but we capitalize it in the English because it stands for the National Institution for Transforming India. And indeed, many commentators have said that India's foreign policy is dedicated to the objective of supporting India's transformation. So India's transformation from, as it were, where we were at the time of independence, is a 100-year project, and we're now talking about the coming 25 years in the project. And I've drawn freely on an essay on economic transformations, more in the developed world, that was put out last year by Roger Bootle, because I think it is of some relevance as we think about our own transformation. I won't go through all of these, but I would just say the following are important: that there's no single silver bullet. Leadership matters, but leadership over 25 years in a democracy therefore means the passing of the torch from one parliament to the next, and a national consensus. And I would say that India has had that national consensus really from 91 onwards, which is why we've been able to achieve what we have. Goals are important, so you know whether you're on track, but so is flexibility. A strategy and consistent behavior are needed to communicate long-term intent to many actors. So I think the private sector in India basically understood that the commitment to liberalization was not going to change in a hurry, and so they made bets on that basis. And so I think a debate like the one we're having here on what that strategy consists in and should be about is important in a democracy. My own view is that having in the first couple of decades had a strategy to deal with the problems of insufficient food and hunger, which led to the Green Revolution. And then, after that, I would say when I first came to NCR, the need of the hour was connectivity and infrastructure. And I would argue that we're not quite there yet. We've achieved a lot, including in digital connectivity. So I would say the strategy for our Amrit Kal is to harness our demographic dividend and generate better jobs, higher paying jobs, and I'll come to that later in my presentation. Now, macro stability is important, but it's not sufficient. I would say that the whole process of growth is mysterious, but stability is a precondition, a necessary condition, but it doesn't deliver growth. What economists would call microeconomic measures and governance are more powerful. High rates of investment are critical, which also necessitates high rates of saving. And competition is a key driver of efficiency, including competition from abroad, which is why trade openness becomes so important. India's journey, because of its size and scale, is distinctive. I just want to point out some of the respects in which we will have to chart our journey for ourselves. So I mentioned that we are lower middle income. Managing a transition to upper middle income, let alone to high income, is going to be hard if we are expected to do so with a significantly reduced use of coal, because all countries before us have basically developed on the basis of cheap fossil fuels, often coal. But as we know, the environment, the atmosphere or the environment has paid a penalty. And so India is being asked to embark on this journey, putting its trust in a series of relatively new and to some extent expensive technologies. As a democracy, inclusiveness has to be more central to India than many of its predecessors. I mean, universal suffrage has been a characteristic of India since 1947, but it really only came to the United States, arguably, in the mid-1960s when blacks were truly enfranchised. Women were unenfranchised in many parts of the developed world until the early 1920s. So this is distinctive about India. And finally, India is a subcontinent. It's really like the EU, it's almost individual countries. So spatial inequality and convergence between the poorer and the richer states is a reality that needs to be countered. I talked about reform over this long horizon as a process of redefining the interfaces among four key sets of actors. Firstly, there is the public-private interface, citizens and civil society. I should say citizens and government, citizens, civil society, and government. And this is summed up by the Prime Minister in when he talks of ease of living, uh, what sometimes is called the Citizens' Charter. But there are other dimensions to how the state, broadly conceived, should engage with citizens, and there are some examples there: demographic management, labor market and skilling, human development, social safety nets, and social mobility. But then the intersection between the public sector and the private sector, which I think still remains somewhat contentious. Somebody talked about a stigmatized private sector. I don't think there's the kind of ease between government and the private sector, even though we all know that jobs are created by the private sector. And so there are a number of dimensions of the public and private interface that will need to be reformed. And there are steps in that direction, as I said, in the budget. Then there is the interaction between the center and the states. And finally, there is global engagement, because India already, as the fifth largest economy in the world, soon to be the third largest economy in the world, having successfully delivered a challenging G20 at a difficult political time, has a new place and a new voice in the world. But this involves reciprocal obligations. So if we want access to other people's markets, including labor markets, we need to be prepared to do that as well. So I would say that these are directions of motion over the next 25 years that will be needed to realize the aspiration, economic, social, and, if you like, the comfort of a modern society, including, very importantly, personal security, a sense of justice, irrespective, and social mobility. Let me, in my final section, talk particularly about the issue of jobs and what that means for inclusion, because India's commitment is not to growth at any cost, but it has to be inclusive growth, because we're a democracy and because politicians know, while we remain a democracy, that it is only if they deliver inclusion that they can expect to keep their jobs. This is a schematic that just indicates how some of us think about the labor market, broadly characterized. So there is the supply of labor, where getting human capital, or getting a labor force which is ready for 2047 means attention to health and nutrition, and to education and skilling. And while we have a national education policy which is or designed to, as it were, liberate the capabilities of students at all levels through things like instruction in the mother tongue, I think most people would acknowledge that even before COVID, the learning outcomes at all levels, including, unfortunately, at the highest level, are well short of what they should be, given the investment that's being made in education. So education and skilling are, as it were, joined at the hip. So those are the interventions that are needed on the supply of labor. The demand for labor, though, is equally important, and my next slide will indicate what some of the pathologies are, but you would have also heard, and I've heard even in my day here in Bangalore, I mean, there was the complaint by Larsen and Toubro that they had positions for 45,000 engineers that they could not fill. And most people would say when they're looking for skilled personnel in all kinds of roles, they're not to be found. And so because this is such a giant labor market, 580 million people, and a labor market which is in the process of skilling itself by increasing its enrollment in medical colleges, engineering colleges, degree universities, there is a kind of a big problem of matching of skills to opportunities. And that's something that both the private sector and the government have to be engaged in. And finally, there are new opportunities. Climate-related jobs, the energy transition, technology and innovation. And again, Bangalore is at the leading edge of all of this. But I also have a line here on enablers, governance, fiscal, and finance. And as the Prime Minister has said, our present system of administration and governance is not future ready. And so we are going to have to think through, as it were, what a new, more modern system of administration at all levels looks like. I just wanted to indicate why change is needed. So Indian firms are employment pygmies, and the question is why. And what do I mean by employment pygmies? This is a complicated graph, but what it is basically telling you is that comparing India with the US, that essentially even as firms age, they don't hire as many people as their US counterpart. So there is a deep anti-labor bias in the Indian employment sector. This is formal as well as private incorporated companies. And so coaxing Indian business through the reforms I talked about earlier to take on more labor is going to have to be an important part of the strategy. Finally, let me just talk about some timelines for reform. Firstly, I think we should be thinking of roughly the life of this next parliament, 24 to 29, but let's extend it to 2030 because that is large, that will cover both the 18th Lok Sabha largely and also the award of the current Finance Commission, the 15th Finance Commission, and the new 16th Finance Commission, which will deliver its award next year. Thirdly, India has already committed its climate change goals until 2030 to UNFCCC, is the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. And by the end of this decade, if we are able to maintain our rhythm, India will be the third largest economy in the world, and that carries its own obligations and opportunities. So I would say that the life of this parliament, and I'll come to what some of the action points might be, is what we can really think and plan on. And some of the, if you like, foundations were articulated in the July budget of this government. Then by 2035, using the metrics that I presented earlier, we would be transitioning from lower middle income to upper middle income. And the reason that's important, as some of you who are economists might know, is that there's a bogeyman out there called the middle income trap. And what we have found with Latin America is that indeed many countries have somehow peaked at the upper middle income level. They never quite make it to upper income status. And so the challenge for India, once it gets to upper middle income, is not to get stuck there, but like Korea and like a country like Chile, which is much smaller than us, to see that we can generate enough momentum to be one of the few countries that goes from upper middle income to advanced economy, to rich, I say upper income, not advanced, that's an error. And then we've already committed that by 2070, we will be a net zero economy. So by 2047, we need to be firmly on the track of decarbonization. So 2070 net zero becomes a realistic possibility. So just looking at the next 5 years, I would say that these are a crucial period for achieving India's sustainable development goals. I haven't gone into those, but that's also a responsibility of NITI Aayog. And laying the foundation for net zero by 2070 and Viksit Bharat at 2047. And here's a set of practical agenda items: accelerating and sustaining growth, raising female labor force participation, managing rapid urbanization, thinking about all the implications of climate change for our fiscal accounts, labor market, skilling, climate financing and adaptation at the state level, applying artificial intelligence to social sectors as the next phase of India's digital journey, and spending more on public health. So I think with that, I've exhausted my 30 minutes, and I think that's going to be more than exhausted. I think we're ready for the next stage of the program.
First, thank you very much, Mr. Bery. It was a tour de force of everything that actually we ought to be doing. But maybe I can start with something that's always been of concern to me, thinking about, if you will, India's development over the last 15, 20 years. We've had periodically we've had kind of projections about where we're going to be. I mean, in 2018 it was $5 trillion economy, or you've had many projections from the past. Remember Ajit Ghosh saying something like, development is not, the development was not really about necessarily rising incomes, but structural transformation. And so maybe I should start by asking you. You give some clues as to how you think the really challenging process of structural transformation can actually occur. And I think we'd all agree that although it is true that 6% growth is nothing to sniff at, the rate of structural transformation, the kind of change that we saw in other economies, which actually made it, as you said, to high income levels, we're not seeing it at least at that pace, or the pace that we would like in India. So maybe you could speak a little bit to what you think are the biggest impediments to the kind of movement of people out of, let's say, low productivity, not just agriculture, but in some sense low productivity surplus sector kind of work, into the kind of work that is actually both remunerative and actually can help people generate the kind of livelihoods that would be really true of, let's say, a Viksit Bharat. Maybe we can start with that question.
Look, maybe questioning the data, it's on, yeah, is the last refuge of the scoundrel. But let me just indicate what some of the stuff is that has been crossing my desk. I don't know if Amit is here, but obviously his state of labor report is necessary reading. So firstly, I mean, there's the gross value. I don't want to make this too geeky, so you tell
Sure.
me if I'm
Okay.
making it too geeky. Okay. So, firstly, the question is, um, there's levels, and then there's also changes. Um, so, for instance, somebody who I think is fairly credible, Vishwanath Golda,
Mm,
is arguing that uh, that the fact that we're not resorting to the technique of double deflation
mhm.
does mean that there is systematic underestimation of the share of manufacturing in the economy. I'm taking it on trust,
Yeah.
although, I mean, that's an issue for Mosby. The second point I would make is that we are all dazzled by um, China, but in uh, much of economics, where you are depends on where you started from, what economists call path dependence. Now, uh, it is the case that China, and before it, the Soviet Union, uh, had, for reasons of self sufficiency, a highly biased economic system towards manufacturing. But if you actually look at more market economies and the share of manufacturing now, uh, we are not that far off.
Mhm.
Okay, so now the question is the peak still ahead of us?
Right.
But where we are right now is about where Brazil is today. I cannot say whether Brazil has come down. I think the question then becomes really, uh, why should you be worrying about this? Uh, why are you worrying about the structural transformation? And it has to be not just because other countries have done it, but because it matters for something that matters. And my hunch is that you're saying that as a consequence, we have had less good jobs than we might have. Is
More or
that
less.
what's in your
Yes,
mind?
yes, more or less. That
Okay.
that in fact many of the jobs that we have are not as where you might want to have them are more high productivity jobs, and that's really, if you will, the Kuznets process, not the Lewis process, right?
Right.
So the concern is, if
Uh,
what would be the kind of things that one should be aiming for to make sure that the jobs that we generate are high productivity jobs. I suppose that would be another way of putting
well,
it.
yes. So,
In sufficiently large scale. Sorry. Yes.
right. Um, there's, again, um, the World Bank, coming down to your earlier point, and I'll address the second one. So, there is the sense that uh, agricultural employment uh, is, or the people are stuck there in low productivity agricultural employment. But a recent report from, and I'll be talking about this tomorrow at IIM Bangalore, um, basically looking at India in a cross country perspective, actually found that the um, shakeout um, of employment from agriculture in India was more or less again on par. The issue was more, as it were, uh, who was there to uh, to take up the slack, and there is this amorphous category called services.
Right.
Now, the reality is we don't know a hell of a lot about services and service sector jobs. Um, and the notion that they are all kind of dead end jobs is probably not good, not justified. But I come back to the basic theme, which is that of the second part of my presentation, which is that uh, there are large, as it were, frictions in two areas. One is turning educational qualifications into employable skills.
Yeah.
And then, second, in matching employers and employees. And then also the fact that so much of our um, enterprise sector is the micro enterprise.
Enterprises, yeah.
Okay, so I would say that uh, talking in broad brush, we probably need to get beyond in order to exploit the demographic dividend in Amrit Kal. Now, what we are seeing now that we have the periodic labor force survey is that actually casual workers' wages are rising. It's salaried workers' wages that are stagnating,
Yeah.
which again points to an imbalance because the scale on what's been happening in people investing at upper levels in their own education is enormous. I mean, in engineering colleges, medical colleges, graduate degrees, etc. And so this is the proverbial frog in the python that's going to have to take time to
To go
go
through.
through.
Again, two things that you mentioned in passing. I wonder if you would speak a little bit more about the difficulties of managing the spatial inequality that we have in this country. And the reason I'm mentioning this is obviously among all the great federated states, India is probably the one where you've got the biggest ratio between poor states and rich states. And of course, all of this has very strong implications, both for what the Finance Commission will be doing, as well as delimitation, all of those kind of questions. And that seems to be something that will be in this very next parliament, right? That these are the kind of questions which have to be taken up. So, given the idea that we really need an inclusive set of, if you will, policies and patterns of growth, how do you think about the spatial inequalities that we have in this country and how to manage those?
Lots of responses. So, firstly, I did have this exposure to Europe, I would say, over the decade 2012, when I started with Shell, and till 2022, when I joined NITI or took over this position at NITI, because of my association with the European think tank Bruegel, with which I still have a kind of a passive association. Um, and the EU has invested a huge amount in regional policies and connectivity. Uh, and it's not clear that all of it has been a huge success, which is to say that our understanding of poverty traps, spatial traps, even in countries with very good data, is weak.
Limited, yeah.
There is the assertion, particularly by those who opposed the opening of the economy and liberalization, that trade has been, that opening in the Indian economy to trade has actually exacerbated inequalities. I would approach this from a somewhat different point, which is that um, actually the work, economists frankly don't know much about what generates growth. But one hypothesis is that it comes from the gains from trade. And that leads me to think that, a bit like Europe, if we were to keep steadily progressing down the road of integrating our market, in which China has been so much more successful, that uh, that itself would probably be more powerful than explicit, as it were, regional policies. And from that point of view, I would say our infrastructure thrust is a very, and the GST and all of that. Uh, I think what would be very detrimental if nativist kind of tendencies in states, uh, coupled with reservations, etc., if these were to balkanize the Indian labor market, because we do have, and Bangalore is a superb example of that, we do have the luxury, it may be still temporary migration, not permanent migration. So I think that, as it were, uh, internal liberalization, housing, so that there is, and particularly rental housing, so to because remittances are and can be and should be a very powerful instrument for equalization. Okay. Now, over and above that, we have various kinds of social safety nets. After all, at the end of the day, the Garib Kalyan Yojana and the you know the food rations, but those are handouts. And I think what we're talking about is closing gaps on a sustainable way. Having said all that, something that NITI is very involved in is space-based policies at a micro level, the aspirational districts, the aspirational blocks. So, strategically, what I would say is uh, a, a better common market, including labor market, uh, coupled with, as it were, more micro space-based policies.
Um, is a concern of yours that you've had in many of the things you've worked on in the past, which is that about of resilience. Now we've gotten used to, as you said, 6% growth over 30, some would say even 40 years, and of course that's not a given that that's going to happen. Um, so my question is, I share with you the kind of belief that we have uh, maybe a little more resilience than we did maybe 50 years ago to all the kinds of shocks that typically generated or hurt growth in let's say the economies of the 70s and 80s. But the world is of course changing, and you have these poly crises of very many sorts. You have the climate crises and so on. Is there anything that concerns you in terms of what would be the main concern that you have for the resilience of this economy?
Well, I mean, I think both center and states ought to be building up fiscal buffers. I think the center has been, attempting to do so, and some of these are being institutionalized by the Finance Commission in terms of disaster grants, and so. What am I saying? What I'm saying is that fiscal populism is probably not the best way of creating resilience. Okay. Similarly, but again, one needs to look carefully at some of the measures that are uh, being rolled out, because they are a form of social security. I'm talking about transfers to women and stuff like that. So I'm not going to dismiss them all, but all I'm saying is that um, uh, resilience and the ability to react does depend on, as it were, fiscal space. Okay, so that's point number one. Point number two is um, flexible. So lifelong learning and the flexibility to change jobs is, I think, something we're going to have to, because that's been, I mean, the US is not the country it was when I first got there in the 1970s, but um, the this whole system of community colleges and the whole way their higher education system is, that you are never too old to learn, you're never too old to invest in yourself. I think that, as we look to the future, would be another way in which we could build in resilience at the individual level. But then, transportation and really affordable housing are very important ways, because the shocks are also going to be regional.
And we can already see that the shift from, the mining belt of the east to, if you like, the solar belt of the west, that's going to require fairly major um, shifts in employment patterns, fiscal patterns.
Thank you very much, Mr. Bery, and thanks all for the questions.
Thank you for being
Okay.
here.